current issue of foreign affairs. And indeed, over the last years, we have seen the people electing into power strong leaders who have promoted and quickly produced illiberal democratic imaginaries and practices. These leaders backed agendas that adversely affect human rights, and they have sought to curtail the independence of the judiciary. The so-called will of the people, through the democratic system of representative government, sometimes manifested desires that wrought religious and chauvinistic nationalism and outbursts of racism. Democratic institutions have also been on the decline, with growing mistrust and loss of legitimacy in political parties, and in the face of the revelations about the manipulative and subversive effects of information technology and algorithms on people's fear and behaviors, also in the institution of electoral democracy and the media. The Western democratic narrative that has for a long time mitigated the underlying contradictions between democracy and capitalism, between political inclusion through democratic politics on the one hand and the exclusion from the spoils of economic growth on the other hand, have been broken for a great many people. Combined with fear of terror, large-scale migration, and a sense of loss of control, the idea of democracy is under siege. Will democracy as a form of political order we know today survive the changes and challenges it is experiencing these days? Does democratic practice need to be rethought and renewed in the light of these challenges? And if so, how might this happen? And our distinguished panelists have thought, written extensively on various aspects of democracy and the bedrock of human rights norms with which democracy is inextricably bound to in Western liberal conception. Baroness Helena Kennedy is barrister, broadcaster, writer, and Labour member of the House of Lords. She is one of Britain's most eminent human rights thinkers and practitioners. Her new book, If War Shame, deals with routine discrimination against women in the legal system. From 2006 to 2007, she chaired the Power Inquiry to look into the state of British democracy and why there is a decline in participation and loss of interest by people. Sunil Khilnani is a scholar of Indian history and politics. He is the author of the acclaimed The Idea of India. His recent book, Incarnations, India in 50 Lives, explores across the span of 2,500 years the personalities of men and women who changed India and the world. Sunil is the director of the King's India Institute at King's College. Salman Khurshid is an eminent Indian politician, a former Union Law Minister of India, lawyer and writer. His new book, Triple Talaq, Examining Faith, unravels and analyzes the Triple Talaq court case wherein in August 2017 a narrowly divided Indian Supreme Court held that the practice of instantaneous talaq, which authorized a Muslim man to divorce his wife by pronouncing 3 times the word talaq, legally invalid. Brian Klaas is a political scientist and columnist for the Washington Post, as well as a fellow in Comparative Politics at the London School of Economics and Political Science. He's the author of The Despot's Accomplice, How the West is Aiding and Abetting the Decline of Democracy. His new book, co-authored with Nick Cheeseman, How to Rig an Election, analyzes the recession in electoral democracy, examining 6 ways to rig elections. And I'm Ornit Shani, and my recent book, How India Became Democratic, explores how India made the universal franchise at independence and how this process played a key role in institutionalizing democracy and popular political imagination against the odds at independence. And what we'll try to do in our conversation today, on the basis of insights from your works and your experiences also as practitioners, some of you, to better understand the different mechanisms and dynamics that enable the decline in democracy and engage with a thought experiment and try to explore how thinking against the grain of common assumptions about democracy might help us to regenerate the idea and ideas of democracy. And Helena Kennedy, let me please start with you. In 2006-07, as I mentioned, you chaired the Power Inquiry, which looked into people's disillusionment with democracy, with the fall down in participation, interest in political parties. In the early 1990s, we had this great hope of democracies, blossoming with the fall of the Berlin Wall, the Soviet Union, all these new republics, and democracy was on the rise. Can you please try to tell us what happened to that trajectory? What went wrong?
Well, it's a really important question, because I think that in any discussion about what's been happening to democracy, you have to go back to the end of the Cold War. And I think that sense of triumphalism, where the West felt that Western ideas had triumphed, and that capitalism and liberal democracy were basically the name of the game, and that communism had totally failed, and with that, of course, there was the illusion with socialism. That triumph that was felt in many parts led to a sense that somehow neoliberal economics then began to swell as the way of doing things. And so I think that surge of globalization then in turn has fed into lots of feelings of alienation in publics in many parts of the world. While globalization has benefited some, it has undoubtedly had a toll in certain societies. In Britain, what was interesting, and I'm sort of, if you like, contributing from the British perspective, was that here in Britain we became very clear that particularly after the Iraq War, but it had been building up long before that, a sense amongst British people that they weren't listened to. And we've seen a great decline in membership of political parties. There were more people who were members of the Royal Society for the Protection of Birds than there were in the Labour Party or in the Conservative Party. It's really true. And in conservation things like the National Trust looking after our castles and our manor houses and so on. But a real decline in party membership, something that's changed just now recently because of the shift in the Labour Party with the arrival of Mr. Corbyn. But there was no doubt there was a great decline in party membership and a lowering of turnout for elections. And so the Roundtree Foundation paid for an inquiry, which was set up with a significant sum of money, to travel around the country and be really meeting with people in community centres and so on, saying, did you vote in the last election? If not, why not? And what came through very clearly, and I think this is common to the United States, I think it's common in lots of different places, was a sense of being left behind, of not being listened to, that there were notional consultations with the public, but actually the decision had been made before the consultation as to what was going to be done, and it was window dressing. And so lots of people felt very alienated from their politicians. They also had a sense that politicians were professional politicians, that they kind of almost sort of geared themselves up from the age of 20 to become politicians, deciding at university to study politics, and that was their trajectory. So I think that there was an alienation with the political class, a feeling of being left out of any decision making, and also a sense that decisions were being made somewhere else. And then, of course, you get what's led to Brexit, a sense that it's Europe that makes decisions outside of Britain, or that decisions are being made by multinational companies, and that there's no purchase on this in ordinary politics, that power lies elsewhere. And so the Power Inquiry was saying, where does power lie in our modern world? And there is no doubt that if you like, the masters of the universe, great bankers, the people running multinational companies, in many ways have more power than our politicians in national governments do. So there is, I think, that has led to the alienation of many people.
So, from this alienation of people, I'm coming to you, Salman, with actually an example, the Triple Talaq case in India, which is an example of women organizations and organizations from below trying to assert their rights. And I would like to try and place the deep exploration that you suggest in your book of the court case of Triple Talaq and your involvement in the case. You were an amicus of the court in the broader context of India's secularism. Secularism, of course, is a notion, a pillar notion of democracy at a time when the idea of secular India faces real threat by Hindu nationalism's zeal to redefine India as Hindu. And I want to go back for a second to a statement by Supreme Court Justice O. Chinnappa Reddy in 1991, when he said, upon reviewing all the articles of the Indian Constitution which may bear upon the secularist goal of the framers, that, and I quote, secularism in India cannot be separated from the quest for socio-economic justice. So one of the striking things in this case on, that women addressed the Indian Supreme Court to make triple talaq invalid was the disagreement between the judges about the basic questions, such as the legal status of triple talaq. Was it or was it not codified in 1937, which would have effect on whether it's affect the constitution or valid or not valid? Is it part of personal law or not? Is it part of the tenets of Islam or not? And from your descriptions in the book, we see that this is indeed a contentious issue, and it's a question that has relevance beyond India. And a key issue here seems to me is the extent to which democracy and human rights, and in this case women's right, can coexist with personal religious law, with which it may not be compatible. And can you tell us what do you think the decision of the case tells us about the relations between the two, between democracy and personal religious law? And if you see it as a problem of compatibility, how do you think it can be resolved?
Well, India is a very vast country, and you could probably at any given time find all the patterns that you see here in Europe and elsewhere existing at the same time. And I'll try to make it as concise as possible. We've been through that phase where everybody said politicians are bad, and there was in Delhi the movement of Mr. Kejriwal when he brought ordinary people out and called it the Ordinary People's Party. Won something like 95% of the seats in the assembly, wiped out every other established party. And then it's come to a point where everybody's cursing him now for why there is no water and there's no electricity. So you can find India, the phases go very, very quickly. But your critical question is about whether human rights and personal laws can be compatible and how religion can be part of a plural democracy. Very clearly, we protect faith and religion in our constitution, as all democracies do. The problem is about what is faith and what is religion. I don't think India has now has yet reached a stage where it can, or the Indian Supreme Court can define religion, as Ronald Dworkin had said, that there can be a religion without God. For us, God is very important for religion. Although we have religions like Sikhism and Buddhism, where the idea of God is far more morphic, not quite like the God as most people know. The trouble with the Supreme Court was that this whole idea of triple talaq, which is actually a very simple thing to understand, it's an adulterated version of the 3 opportunities of giving divorce that is given to a man, knowing fully well that a woman also has a right of divorce, and this goes back 1400 years. So it's not something that legislation is given now. With the 3 lots of judges in the Supreme Court, the Chief Justice and one more judge, the Muslim judge with him, said that this is a 14-year-old tradition, it must be protected, it's a fundamental right, we cannot interfere in it, but Parliament can interfere if it's like, which seems a bit strange thing to say, that if courts can't interfere, how can Parliament interfere? The second lot of judges, the single judge who stood up and said, I've read the Quran, that's Justice Kurian Joseph, I've read the Quran, there is no place for instant triple talaq in the Quran, and that's the end. That's the end. No further discussion. The third lot, again, very good judges. There were 2 of them, led by Justice Rohinton Nariman, who said, well, this is, I know, part of Islam, and it's been incorporated, as you said, in 1937 into Indian law, and because it's incorporated into Indian law, it's subject to the Constitution non-discrimination clause, and therefore it goes. Nobody knows why it's gone, but it's gone. And it's gone in such a peculiar way that the government of India has now brought legislation saying, this is a terrible thing, we will outlaw it. So they've forgotten what the Supreme Court has done. But the critical question that remains is, what is faith, what is religion, so that could be protected in the constitutional scheme of things. Is faith what the women think it is, or is faith what some men think it is, or is faith what some judges think it is, or is faith what the religious people think it is? This issue remains unresolved in the Supreme Court, although there are a series of judgments that have said that when you want to decide what is faith, you have to go to the faithful to ask them what is faith. You can't impose it upon them. But I think this is a question that the court will return to sooner or later. The question in terms of democracy and politics is that, of course, if women feel that they have these rights or should have these rights, you've got to protect them, which is what the court has done. And without protecting women and therefore protecting human rights, your democracy is incomplete. But then if somebody says, you're protecting women, but you're crushing my rights of faith and religion, then how do you find that common place? The interesting thing in Indian politics today was that the women who were fighting for the cause were being supported by a government that is seen as being anti-Muslim. So were they really helping the women because they felt the women needed this as a matter of human rights, or were they doing it because they thought we could divide a community and then take advantage of it? That's a larger political question that obviously time will decide.
Okay, so it's indeed, you talked about the political, and the reason I came to this Supreme Court Justice Reddy is because of indeed how do you perceive of secularism and the way that we have to think about it as something that is interlinked with the question of equality and equality of women. Helena, I want to...
I was just going to say, because it's reminding me, right just now here, of course, in Britain, we're having this argument about Northern Ireland and abortion. And it's sort of similar, which is whether you have a clash of women arguing for their rights and taking it to the Supreme Court, and yet people saying, but this is a matter which should be decided locally in Northern Ireland by the Irish people as to how they want the law to be, and it's not for somewhere else. And it's rather interesting about how human rights is, what the purpose and role of judges protecting human rights should be in a circumstance where you have a clash of rights. And that's always one of those problems. But it's why you want to have a judiciary and why democracy depends on, I think, and I would canvass for liberal democracy, that you're talking about the importance of the rule of law and the independence of the judiciary as the twin pillar with democracy of the decent society. And so once you undermine that, then you really are creating the potential for real conflict within societies.
Yeah, so from undermining judiciary, let's move to undermining basic electoral democracy institutions. And Brian, you argue and show us very convincingly in your books that we're in the middle of a serious democratic recession. You analyze the ways, paradoxically, established democracies undermine democracy in the world by aligning with authoritarian regimes or by setting a very low bar to what is being accepted as a democracy, and the systemic ways in which elections are being rigged. In the solutions you offer, you discuss ways of developing more effective systems of election monitoring, harnessing digital technology, and empowering opposition and civil society. And you stress emphasis on the prospect of the international community to do so, and particularly the need that you write about to revamp Western support for the cause. And the question I want to ask you to think about is how to empower, in fact, the possibility of change from within, or how to inspire domestic agents of change. We have seen many failures of external Western support, and perhaps we need to stress more emphasis on drawing inspiration and support from South, other democratic experiences, and especially the West, as you show us in your books, is not doing so well at the moment with democracy. So.
Sure. Thank you. That's a great question. So I think we have, as you say, a real crisis of democracy globally. And that's not just a crisis in the world, it's also a crisis within the West. And there's a feedback loop between those two, in my view. So in my view, there are basically four major forces that shape global affairs. Those are the US, the EU on one side, and Russia and China on the other side, which are the forces that can basically do enough to intervene or manipulate politics in other countries, say in Africa or other parts of the world. And right now you have a situation in which there is not an appetite to promote or model democratic behavior nearly to the same extent as in the 1990s and early 2000s in the West. So in the US, you have somebody who is modeling authoritarian behavior, frankly, from the White House. who is attacking democratic allies and championing authoritarian regimes. At the same time, the EU has less capacity to do the same level of democracy promotion it did in the past, because it is partly diverting resources to cope with Brexit, and partly because it is coping with the rise of authoritarian populism in Eastern Europe, right, in places particularly in Hungary and Poland. So that means that the world is increasingly getting shaped by new emerging authoritarian powers like China and Russia. And it's why it's particularly important for there to be strong models and beacons of democracy from within the global South. Because I do not believe that the West is occupying that role as it did in a lot of places where I've done research in Sub-Saharan Africa, authoritarian post-Soviet Europe, Southeast Asia, etc. And they're losing this battle of ideas. Now, I think that being said, not all is lost. The West is still a major force for championing democracy, but it is experiencing the same types of democratic decline as many parts in the world, where there is a slow chipping away and erosion of institutions, politicization of democratic norms. And so the two concepts, before I get into the meat of your question about the domestic uprising for democracy, that I'd like you to think about, two analogies. One is the idea of democracy as a sandcastle. Sandcastles take a long time to build, and they're much, much longer to perfect. If you want to make a wow sandcastle, it's going to take a long time. But it can get washed away pretty quickly. And that's what I think is we're seeing with democracy, is these systems that take a very long time to build and perfect, hitting wave after wave of authoritarian populism. And I don't think we should take for granted that they will still be standing in the same form if we don't stop this. The second thing is the idea of democratic norms as guardrails, soft guardrails for democracy. So we, of course, have rule of law, as we've talked about. That's a much harder guardrail, especially if the judiciary is doing its job. But democratic norms, what's acceptable and what's done in democracy, those are much more wishy-washy, and that's where populists are really taking advantage. They're able to chip away at institutions, create new normals, and bring authoritarian styles of governance around the edges into previously democratic polities. Now, the reason why I say this to preface the point about how this is a domestic solution we need is that I have lived under authoritarian governments for many, many months at a time in different parts of the world. And one thing that I'm very, very sure of is that we have it better in democratic systems. And it means that we also have the opportunity to fix our own democracy. So I think the moment that we're in right now is a wake-up call. It's a wake-up call to reinvigorate our democracies, potentially to rewrite some institutions, to make some soft norms into laws, but also to reinvigorate the civic engagement that actually creates that sandcastle, right? And the reason we need to do that is because we take for granted so many things, and we of course have real challenges. We of course have inequality. We of course have the victims of globalization. It can get much worse. And so one of the most depressing things I find with this, Britain, I mean, I salute your work in looking at Britain's democracy. I think the US has a lot of introspection to do because the last midterm congressional elections, our voter turnout was 36%. And I've observed elections in the developing world that would be condemned for that level of participation for being illegitimate. So I think the real message is we are in an emergency. It's not too late, but we need to wake up to the perils of democracy and shore up that sandcastle before it gets washed away.
And the warning you're posing for us is actually very relevant. It's very relevant to bring India into at that point, because it's one of the only democracies, the largest in the world, where actually participation, turnouts in elections, and interest in parties and elections are still very, very high and not declining. Still, a lot of challenges to India's democracy. And Sunil, I would like to turn here to you following that question, going to the south. Is in your acclaim the idea of India, which now was republished with a new introduction to celebrate its second anniversary, you show how India was built on values, notions of diversity, pluralism, and freedom. Paradoxically, that political order also produced in full swing today a very narrow definition of the nation as Hindu, which leaves very little space for diversity, plurality, safety for minorities, and freedom of speech. And as you know, in how India became democratic, I show how at independence a staggering operation to include everyone, right, to make universal franchise something that really built a democratic political imagination worked out. And when you wrote the idea of India 20 years ago, what we see today did not seem likely to happen. So the question is, what would be the way for Indians to resurrect its democratic roots? Would it need to look back into the past? You have been looking into the past in your incarnation, right? So would they need to go into the past, or would it need a different idea of democracy?
Okay. Well, actually, just to clarify, I mean, when I did write the idea of India 20 years ago, it was precisely because I did fear the challenges that were arising to India's democratic experiment. And in fact, I think I argued very clearly at that time that the rise of a different kind of definition of the nation was something that was, happening with a lot of force behind it, and was something that, in the end, Indians would really have to think about whether which way they wanted to go. So the argument I tried to make there was not that one single conception of India, one idea of India had sort of triumphed. Rather that modern Indian history has always been this contest, this struggle between at least two very different conceptions of what India is. One which has been defined much more, I would say, borrowing from the European definition of what a nation is. A nationalism that's defined by a single religion or a single culture or a single language or a single ethnicity, which are the definitions that all the great European nationalisms of the 19th century adopted. And those are the ideas that many on the, if you like, the sort of religious forms of nationalism in India adopted wholesale, whether in Hindu or Muslim form. Their great heroes were figures like Mazzini and so on, who were the advocates of this European idea. There's another conception of what India could be, which was always a romanticized conception, a somewhat fantastic view of the Indian past. But it was this sense that India was this confluence. And precisely, it was India's diversity, its diverse kinds of diversities, that were not a weakness, which from a European nationalist point of view would be a weakness, but were its strength. And so this is a view you get articulated in a kind of poetic form in Tagore, you get articulated in a sort of ethical, religious form in Gandhi, and then you get the kind of most complicated and challenging effort to turn that vision into a state form in the work of Nehru and his colleagues, and Baker as well. And so that was always a contest. I mean, it wasn't that one had triumphed over the other. And I think for me, what's interesting about the idea of India, and I think somewhat unique, is that it allowed the space for that contest to be played out. So it was never the triumph of one idea over the other, but as I tried to say, I mean, for me, the idea of India is the capacity to entertain a variety of ideas of India and to leave it open. And in a sense, the Constitution, as it was written in the late 1940s, provided this open-ended, not closed definition of what Indian identity was. And that generated a whole series of tensions, one of which was this tension between individual rights and group rights. And that was kind of written in. I mean, I think there was a self-consciousness that was not going to be resolved by fiat. But in a sense, it had to be a political process. Groups within society had, through internal struggle, had to allow the winning of individual rights. Because at the end of the day, I think the Indian project of freedom in the 20th century, as it's written in the Constitution, is about individuality. And it is about the rights of the individual. Although, as I say, it was surrounded by all these other group considerations. So coming back to the vigor of Indian democracy, and I think that is really important, that as we kind of worry about its sort of somnolence in other parts of the world, I mean, in India, it's all too vigorously alive. Yeah. And what I would say actually there, it's sort of interesting contrast with Helena's initial point, which is that what you were suggesting is that in a sense democracy in the West has been a fair weather enterprise. It's been when the going is good that democracy has kind of had its high moments, when economic progress and prosperity has been good. And in that sense, the West has benefited first from empire and then from the post-war boom.
Absolutely.
And when that's turned, then the tensions and the uncomfortable aspects of democracy start to kick in. The interesting thing about India is that it actually began from the very opposite. It began from extreme poverty.
Exactly.
And it began not only from extreme poverty within India, but also from being at the bottom of the food chain in terms of the international economy. And it was that, in a sense, that was the starting point. And I think for the poor in India, and you show this extraordinarily in how this infrastructure of elections gets constructed through this task of even the electoral rolls in India, which 170 million people in the late 1940s. I mean, the books required to print that as you document were just vast. But what that gave, I think, to those at the very bottom of society was their only access to power, and therefore it became so important to them. So what you've seen is the vigor of Indian democracy. And in a curious way, as India has become richer, some of these other tensions have come into play. So in a sense, the Indian story is the contrary of the European story, where, again, in the classical version, if you have a middle class, if you have a kind of bourgeoisie, those are the great bulwarks of liberal democratic values. Well, in India, the state that is most prosperous, that has 3 times the per capita income of any other state, Gujarat, which has the most globalized middle class, is actually the most xenophobic and most religiously bigoted. So I think this idea that that's not aimed at any Gujaratis. I have family in Gujarat. So.
His best friends are Gujarati.
Don't worry.
So I think India does disturb many of these. In a sense, classical myths, and both, right down from the definition of the nation to the relationship to the economy, to who are the great kind of bulwarks and supporters of democracy. And what you see in India today is that those who are most likely to vote are those who are most marginalized in society, the poor, women, and minorities. I mean, the probability that they will vote is much higher than those who are at the top end of the pyramid.
It's so interesting, and I like this idea that it's that Britain's thing is about fair weather democracy, that we're at our best when we're doing well, and then we're not. We just sort of pull down the blinds. But it's very interesting. Just now in Britain, the places that are most vibrant, certainly I say this as someone who comes from ultimately an Irish background, is if you go to Ireland and to Northern Ireland and even with all the conflict and so on, it's always been much more urgently political. People in pubs and so on are arguing and talking about politics in the way that doesn't normally happen. Brexit has done a bit of it here in Britain more recently. I mean, but Scotland, very, again, there's a vibrancy around politics now because of all the business about independence. But you're right. And of course, one of the crises for British democracy is an English crisis. It's about Englishness and the concerns that the English have about what their purpose in the world is, and their loss of empire, their loss of being bigger, and feeling swallowed up in Europe and so on, and not realizing the importance of being part of a community. And so I think we're going to suffer the consequences of that. But it is about identity as well.
Right, yeah.
But if we actually take this West and the West and the different, the non-West experience of democracy and putting India at the center, what I wanted to think about, let's do a thought experiment, right? When we're thinking about democracy, the convention has been to think about Western democracy as a model, as a blueprint for democracy and for democratization across the world. And how about if we want to think of ways of, taking your alarm bell of, we don't want a wave to come on your sandcastle to resurrect, re-energize democracy. How about thinking of experiences from other democracies? Democracy ultimately is an open-ended thing, is a very dynamic thing. Democracy produced terrible results, but it also produced novelties for human dignity and for freedom. How about if we look at the South and try to, rid of our common convention, thinking about the West as the model of democracy, the creator of democracy, in order to have new ideas for re-energizing democracy. And I want to first address you, Sunil, because you wrote a decade ago, you said the following. You said that India represents a reservoir of democratic experiences within a single state, a resource for intellectual reflection that remains still understudied, which is a fact. So what can we learn from it for our current times in the West? What can we take from this reservoir of ideas?
Okay, so I mean, it is, I guess, a retrospective and a forward-looking point. I mean, India is the kind of last of the great hierarchical ancien regime agrarian societies that is modernizing. France has done it. England did it obviously earlier. Russia did it. Germany did it. China has done it. India is the last such society. So it's a kind of historical epoch-making transition. And in those moments, that's what the social sciences and intellectual forms of analysis are for. I mean, that's how the great social and political theories of Europe were born in the 19th century. So it seems to me that, just as a basic point, the engagement with trying to make sense of what India is doing today is of an intellectual challenge which people have just not really woken up to. It's still seen as a kind of small regional or area study story. It's actually the greatest historical shift that's occurring across this century. And not only that, what makes it even more special is it's the only one in history that is occurring under conditions of universal suffrage. None of the others did. So it's this conjunction of a massive social and economic transformation under conditions of democracy, constitutional democracy. We've never seen anything like it. So, it's bound to produce lessons, both positive and negative, to draw from. Now, that's the kind of big point. But, breaking that down, I mean, first of all, if you look at the Indian Union, you have 29 states. The largest of these is over 200 million. Several of them are 80 plus million or 60 plus million. So you've got this incredible laboratory, if you like, of different experiences. And different experiences across a variety of different axes. So different experiences in dealing with, for example, conflict. So you've seen, some states that have gone through intense periods of conflict, violence, secessionist movements, which have actually then reintegrated back into the Union. Punjab would be one case, the states of the Northeast in many cases. You've also had examples of complete disastrous handling of those conflicts, which in Kashmir would be, the example of that, where there's been no learning occurring. So, and then if you take policy, for instance, you look at the vast diversity between what's happening in the north and the south. Women faring far, far better in southern India than they do in northern India. Why is that? Why is that? I mean, do governments come and go in the south as much as they do in the north? What is it that's got governments and bureaucracies there to focus on women's education? And so those are kind of some of the internal lessons, but more broadly and internationally, I think, what's remarkable that India has been able to create, and the electoral infrastructure, I think, is part of this, is a representative order. It's not just that India has elections, it's that India has parties which have a kind of continental footprint. And if you think about Europe's struggle to try to build a representative order today, the complete illegitimacy of the kind of Brussels and other parliaments, that's not, I mean, India somehow has been able to create, and that's a very difficult task, building organizations of that scale. And indeed, Salman Khurshid comes from, is part of a party which is part of that.
I go beyond the learning experience. I think there's something that India has to learn as well from itself, and indeed from other democracies. And the big crisis, I believe, and people like Sunil would examine this more carefully, the big crisis in India today is that we have vast majorities representing people who are actually less than 35% of the popular vote. Now, I know that the United States had a peculiar problem there as well. But for us, the fact that 35% have an overwhelming majority in Parliament and could perhaps even reach a stage where they can overturn the Constitution and amend the Constitution in a manner which is unimaginable.
Yeah.
And that's what worries India today. But the thing to do for India, I believe, is to examine democracies that have proportional representation, that have a list system. We have little groups that hold the entire electorate to ransom because they are concentrated and very powerful in small pockets, but in terms of the vast Indian landscape, they may not have a great meaning at all. And if we were to switch to a proportional representation list system, I know that you'll have something interesting there to say, but it may address some of the very critical issues that we face today. The reason why nobody's thought of this in the past in our country is, and I must be candid and admit, that if you have a comfortable majority at 30%, why would you want to share the 70% with somebody else, right? So that is a critical problem, but I do believe we will have to examine this at some stage.
The problem about getting that change, and I've been involved in discussions about proportional representation in Britain for a couple of decades, is the problem is that you have to be empowered to get it through, and once people are in power, power is delightful. Power is absolutely delightful.
Well, I tell you what, there's a trick in India, because we are all committed to giving 33% of our seats to women. And if that legislation goes through, and 33% of women come into Parliament, perhaps we will get that as well.
But for how many years does it stand and not pass through?
How long will it take?
But you're very,
Can I just say
sure.
one point? I mean, a deep anxiety I have about proportional representation in India, which is that, you know, what it does, and we've seen this in, for example, in Belgium, is it entrenches identities. And one of the things about the current system is that it keeps identities fluid and open. So every election, political parties have to argue to persuade people to see themselves in a particular way. And I think that's one of the dangers is in India, it would actually trap people in their identities, in their collective, as it were, scripted identities. And that, I think, is a really... that's why I think proportional representation isn't the right way for India to go. I mean, the way in which democracy has functioned in India and the way in which it was conceived to function was as a form, as a space, as a mechanism to negotiate identity rather than to assert identity. And I think what we're seeing now is it's moved from that space of negotiating identity to becoming a way of asserting identity. So that's kind of...
I see the point. I mean, I believe that is I think that is important.
Yeah, that's what worries.
That's a very important caveat, but you've got to see that caveat in the context of political parties that are today in power in various parts of India who are clearly identified by caste or community. And caste, because for a good reason, caste read as class in the Constitution has become entrenched, although it's described in judgments as a class, but we all know for practical purposes that it's a caste. And so what we have is a caste democracy in India. What we don't have is a popular democracy.
Yes, but you know, the example you gave at the beginning of when you started to talk about the Aam Aadmi Party, that was an incredible example of how they were able to cut across any caste, class, identity. So we have been seeing that, and just to add to what Sunil said, and I share his view in the following, what we see in India is a very strong anti-incumbency patterns of voting. So in India, a party that wants to be re-elected has to really work hard to convince, because the default is that they're going to be kicked out of power. That's exactly, and that brings me to the US, which you already mentioned. I mean, you know, 3 of the systemic ways of rigging elections that you mention out of the 6 you analyze in your book are very widespread in the US. Gerrymandering, voter suppression, and hacking. How can the South, how can other democracies help the US to fix this?
Yeah, and I think it's a good point. One of the reasons why in the book we put the spotlight a bit on Western democracy is because there has been some hypocrisy in the lecturing of the global South about democracy, right? Where we know best, and you should do it this way, without any sort of introspection about the failings that exist in addition to the election rigging tactics you mentioned, there's also the pervasion of money in politics in America, right, which is extremely
very
consequential. That being said, I think the original question you asked about this idea of Western democracy versus other forms of democracy, I think we have to be very careful. So I think Western democracy should not be prescriptive to the global South in the sense of you do not have to do it the way we've done it. That being said, liberal democracy I believe in very strongly. And I think that I think that anything that's not liberal democracy is not actually democracy.
I agree.
Because if you don't have protections of freedom of the press, if you don't have protections for minority rights, if you don't have rule of law, then the vote is somewhat meaningless, right? That's sort of the purpose of the vote, is to develop a system in which there are all of these other institutions that are part of what forms democracy. So I think that the actual mechanism by which you protect the press, or the mechanism by which the judiciary is appointed, or the mechanism by which you have representation, those are subject to interpretation, and that's where you have laboratories not just within countries and states, but also in all sorts of countries around the world. I mean, there's a lot of different ways to vote. In the Gambia, they recently overthrew a dictator, and the way they vote is with marbles in jars, right? Well, it's harder to in some ways, it's very easy to rig the election because you can just put more marbles in the jars. So I don't think it's really the right solution, but my point is that there's a lot of different places that do a democracy a lot of different ways. I think it's totally fine for Western actors to, and I think it's actually encouraged for Western actors to try to be flexible about the types of democracy. I don't think that they should be flexible on whether or not it's liberal. And I think that ultimately some of these aspects of some of these aspects of populism that we're seeing are people who are violating the spirit of protections for minorities and all of these other rights that actually make democracy work. And I think without those protections, you're going to have mob rule that ends very, very badly.
I really want to support what Brian just said. I mean, you only have to look at Orban in Hungary just now. His attack on the judiciary and an independent judiciary is those sort of things are symbolic. They tell you something. Rather like happened, with Mugabe in Zimbabwe. When you start sacking the senior judiciary and going after them, there's something going on. And his business about really his unwillingness to have any immigrants at all, but is particularly saying he doesn't want anybody who's non-Christian, is another example of signalling the kind, and he's actually said very specifically that he is not for liberal democracy, but he's a Democrat. Well, I don't think he is a Democrat. And I do think that we have to call out those people who call themselves Democrats. And I think it's true also of Russia, where I actually do think that you're talking about a criminal kleptocracy that's in control, and it's a sort of mafia-run nation. And so I don't think we should delude ourselves about it. It can call itself a democracy, it can have elections, and people can vote, but voting is not the measure of whether something is a democracy. And all those other things that Brian mentioned are absolutely fundamental. And so we cannot sacrifice the notion of liberal democracy, because it's those other things that turn democracy, make democracy real.
Thank you. Let's give the audience a chance to ask a few questions. Please, the lady over there.
This is a question for Sunil and Salman. How do you say that we are democratic, when we have cult-like following of the leaders, whether it is in Bengal or it is in South, or one family ruled for so long in India, and now this current administration was, again, everything is like cult-like. We swing one way, whether it is caste-based or community-based, but it is, do you call it democratic change in India, the way it is happening all along?
Well, I mean, if you just think for a moment historically, one of the great reasons across 2,000 years of history when democracy was not considered a good thing, one of the reasons why it wasn't considered a good thing was its proneness to demagogues kind of capturing it. What was that it was kind of a form that actually encouraged the rise of authoritarian leaders. So, in that sense, it's not that surprising. At the same time, though, I think what we see in India is that these leaders also get voted out of power. So, they don't have any kind of natural right to power. But yes, I mean, and particularly today with the use money, with the use of kind of media, etc. These cults of political figures is on the rise. But I think that's part of what democracy is, and that's part of what the contest and challenge that has to be constantly made to power is in a democracy.
But all the misinformation that is happening right now, misinformation and fake news that is going on,
that's a worldwide problem. That's not an Indian problem at all. But with some experience of color politics, let me just tell you this, that it's a phase. I think that there is no option but for democracy to allow evolution. We never had the chance of a revolution in our country, fortunately, but the evolution takes time. And I think that we are, all political parties, for good reason or bad, have reneged on a commitment to educating the voter. And we are moving in the opposite direction constantly, which is a sad thing for all of us who wear the mantle, as it were, of political representation. And I can just simply hope and pray that some of us will emerge to do things that will change the quality of democracy. Now, there is good and bad, and that's why I said Kejriwal was the greatest disappointment, because he seemed to change everything, all the rules of the game. And then we discovered barely a few months later that he was just good at manipulating rather than changing the rules of the game. But someone like that has to emerge to change the rules of the game. Which political party will be able to throw that up? I think the next 10 years will show that.
Okay, please.
Hello? Yeah. I just wondered whether the panel could give an example of a country where the model of democracy actually works.
I'll gladly. So I think that the overwhelming majority of liberal democracies in the West work, and I think that when you take the comparison of authoritarian countries, that's absolutely clear that the majority of innovation, prosperity, and progress in the world is driven by liberal democracies. I'll also say that if you use this thought experiment, imagine that you get to choose which country you're born into, and you don't know which country it's going to be. It can be any of the 192, 193, however you count, of countries in the world. But you can pick either from the hat of authoritarian countries or the hat of democratic countries. Is there anyone in this room who would genuinely pick the authoritarian hat? I do not think so, because the odds that you're going to end up in Eritrea or the Democratic Republic of Congo or North Korea is so much greater that you're going to end up in a place like Singapore, which is a very narrow example of an authoritarian state that works. And it works, by the way, with violating a lot of rights. So, at the end of the day, there is a lot of criticism about democracy right now. I think that's very well deserved, because a lot of people are being left behind, as you so rightly noted. That doesn't mean you say the entire project is worthless. It means that you reinvigorate it and fix it. And I have interviewed so many torture victims, people whose families were killed by authoritarian governments. There's so much of that stuff you don't see in a lot of places that are democratic, and they're real. Yeah. And I think that is something where we cannot allow this moment of sort of beating up on democracy to obscure the reality that it is still true that the best places to live in the world are democracies.
But it's even, just to say another thing, which draws on what Sunil said earlier about India, right, of enabling a lot of things at the same time. One thing that democracy enables, and any other regime doesn't, is at least the hope. You have an infrastructure to generate political hope, because you always have elections where people can vote for better leaders. So actually it's about people taking more responsibility over the government, which they can do in democracy.
Even just now, while Trump is in the White House, I still look there, and I know he's doing terrible things. However, I do still think that there is an investigation taking place under an independent investigator, Mueller, into criminality. I do still think that there is opposition in the Congress and in the upper house and the Senate, and I do still think that there are going to be elections where people have got to get off their seats and get out there and work if they want to replace him. And so until that all stops, it's still somewhere that is has the heart of democracy, and it's about enlivening it And so I haven't given up on the fact that I think that democracy is the way to go, and it has to be liberal democracy with all those other attachments. And I'm a human rights lawyer, and so I mean, like Brian is describing, and I know that others, you're doing your cases on Tariq, the Tariq thing, is that when you're trying to protect the rights of people who do not have much purchase on the system, whose voice is silenced, and for many women, they've felt that for too long. What's the Me Too movement about if it isn't about women saying the law has not delivered for us? And those people, we're having a legal system that gives people opportunity to challenge and to raise issues and to then raise them for parliamentarians to pick up on. That's what happens in democracies. And it's how you enliven democracies, is to get people to try and use their rights. So I feel, in a similar way, I feel that democracy is in crisis. I'm very alarmed about the spread of, let's be clear, the strongman stuff isn't just happening in India. In much worse forms, it's happening in places like Putin, like Erdogan, like the business of Netanyahu. There are all many places around the world where we're seeing, in the Philippines, examples of this kind of authoritarian, so-called Democrats running places. And it is deeply alarming, and we're seeing the rise of fascist parties across Europe because of disillusionment with democracy. And the answer to this is more democracy and more getting out there and trying to save its life.
Please, okay. Shall we take another question, please?
Yeah.
You already gave that, please.
Yeah. We've been discussing the ideas of democracy, and I'm just wondering about the idea of democracy. Have we come through now, with all the examples you've just given about what's happening in Hungary, in America, in India, the idea of democracy being a fair weather concept, in the next decade or so, what will emerge once all the strong men have subsided, hopefully? What kind of a democracy will we have then, do you think?
Do you want to, please?
Yeah, I can try. I mean, the whole point about democratic politics is that it leaves it to the particular definition of the Dimas at that moment to decide what it wants to do. So, I mean, the whole point about it is it's unpredictable and open-ended. And that's why for the Greeks it was a tragic form, because democracy can destroy itself. Mm-hmm. There are no there's nothing within democratic politics that can guarantee its survival. And I think, one point also I would add about this question of does democracy work? Well, and I don't mean this facetiously, but it really depends what you mean by work. I mean, the one thing that democracy promises, and as long as it delivers it is working, is it's a way of getting rid of our rulers, right? It doesn't actually promise anything else, really. So it doesn't promise us a good life. It doesn't promise us environmentally sensible decisions. That's up to us, we who use it. And that goes back to Salman's point about, one of the virtues of democracy, and I think the Athenians saw this, and people like John Dewey in America saw, is that it's an educational process. It's a way of society learning how it's doing, how badly it's doing, and how it can do better. But that requires us as citizens as well to be part of that kind of learning process and to check. So I think that we're far too over-invested in democracy. We think it can do everything for us. The liberal part also, yes, I mean, I think that's important. But I think it's also important to remember that one of the things that's made democracy so powerful and it has allowed it to expand so rapidly across so much of the world is that it's what John Donne, the political theorist, calls a self-indigenizing concept or a self-indigenizing category. That's to say, it's able to absorb the cultural life and ways of doing things of the society in which it goes into. And the world doesn't consist of purely liberal societies, it's societies with liberal instincts. So while we might say we want liberal democracy or democratic liberalism, the fact is that in most of the world, we've got to figure out ways of making democracy work without that liberal inheritance. And that's the challenge, and that's, I think, the challenge that India is struggling with today. The jury's out, we'll see, but it's a hell of a fight.
But Sunil, isn't that business about that, of course, the liberal bit of it is is injected into it as we evolve ourselves. I mean, it's not that long ago in Britain when, you know, women didn't have the vote. We're you know, this weekend celebrating 100 years. It's not that long ago since you know, homosexuality was criminalised and people were punished. You know, those things shift and change, and it shifts and changes with people arguing the case for change. And one of the big things that's happened since the World War II is the business of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, setting out what it is that we need in order to thrive as human beings, and the rights that derive therefore from that underpinning notion of what makes human beings thrive. And I think that constant struggle to you know, which may be a liberal struggle, is something we're all involved in, and maybe at different stages will embrace different bits of it. And it's a great conversation. It's the great conversation of mankind, and it's what we have to see as being so vital to democracy's journey.
I completely agree with that. And then again, I mean, you look at it, you know, 70 years ago, the principle of equality was introduced into the most hierarchical, unequal, socially unequal society in the world.
And was bureaucratized, was procedural.
And was turned into a kind of democratic struggle. And, you know, it has done a great deal, but there's still a great deal to do, but that's the struggle.
Yeah.
So can I, on that note, can I just say that, you know, one of the conclusions of this session is that democracy is something to relentlessly fight for. It's something that we can never settle once and for all, and the responsibility is on us as well as the subject of democracy. So thank you very much, Salman Khurshid.